Kentucky Derby. Just weeks later, he rode Aristides to second place in the Belmont Stakes. Despite his remarkable success, he eventually faded from the public eye in the decades that followed, which was fairly common for black athletes of his day, a lot of their contributions being erased from the official record. But after his racing career, he remained active in the sport as a bookmaker and an innovator. He developed new methods of handicapping, of creating handicapping charts to better analyze and predict race outcomes. Next, Isaac Murphy. Isaac Murphy is widely regarded to be one of the greatest jockeys of all time, bar none, period. He set standards of integrity and performance that defined the profession. In an era where the idea of a jockey as a job didn't really exist, Isaac Murphy defined what it meant to be a jockey. He was originally born in 1861, started as a stable hand. Between 1884 and 1891, Murphy achieved an unmatched record. Let's go through some of the highlights here. Murphy won 3 Kentucky Derbies, 1884, 1890, and 1891. He was the very first jockey to win 3 Kentucky Derbies. And he was the first one to win back-to-back Kentucky Derbies. His lifetime win percentage, we estimate to be around 40%. That is the highest win percentage ever recorded by any American jockey. He was known for his professionalism, his eloquence, and his impeachable record. And he demanded respect in an era where black athletes were often demeaned. Murphy's talents as the leading rider of his era, made him the most sought-after jockey in his career. He was inducted into our Hall of Fame in 1955. And I can't stress this enough. We inducted our very first class of Hall of Famers in 1955. And he was the first person we ever inducted into this Hall of Fame. Literally number 1. A lot of the techniques that we still use to this day were invented by him. We'll talk a little bit about Willie Sims. Willie Sims, born in 1870, he rode for prominent owners William Scott and Philip Dwyer, and he gained a reputation for precision and steady judgment. He became the only black jockey to ever win all 3 races that would become the Triple Crown: the Kentucky Derby, which he won twice, the Preakness Stakes, which he won once, and the Belmont Stakes, which he won twice. His influence went beyond his victories. In 1895, he introduced the American Crouch, which is what it was called back then, the forward-leaning 2-point style, to England, which is the technique that we still use to this day, where jockeys are standing up in the stirrups, leaning forward on the neck of the horse. We call it 2-point. Back then it was called American Crouch when he introduced it to England. His record of achievement, along with his international impact, introducing techniques to England, placed him among some of the sport's most transformative figures. Yet, like so many of his contemporaries, Sims faced shrinking opportunities as oppressive Jim Crow laws tightened their grip on American racing, and mounts became more and more scarce towards the end of the century. He was inducted into our Hall of Fame in 1977. The turn of the century, into the 1900s, brought even more talented riders to the forefront and even more eventual members of our Hall of Fame. For example, Anthony Tony Hamilton was born either 69 or 70, we don't actually know. And he began his career as an apprentice to trainer William Lakeland, who immediately recognized his talent. Hamilton's skill quickly brought him into the employ of some of the most influential owners of the era, including August Belmont Sr., the namesake of the Belmont Stakes. Throughout the 1890s, Hamilton dominated the country's most prestigious handicap races. Let me give you a quick rundown of his wins. The Manhattan Handicap, the Brooklyn Handicap, twice, the Suburban Handicap, and the Metropolitan Handicap. He was the only black jockey to win all 4 of these elite New York-based events, a feat that underscored both his technical mastery and his consistency in the saddle. His professionalism earned him respect from his peers, and fun fact, his wedding reception was hosted in the home of his fellow jockey and contemporary, Isaac Murphy. A lot of these jockeys spent a lot of time together, and in fact, a lot of them lived in the same ecosystem, the same environments, the same cities, the same towns. And they spent a lot of time with each other, sharing knowledge with each other. Hamilton, like many black jockeys in the turn of the century, traveled abroad to continue his racing career after black riders were largely forced out of the sport in America. We'll discuss why that was in a second. But he continued to excel overseas. In 1904, he was racing in Russia, and he had a fall on a horse in Russia, and he finally ended his career in 1904. His legacy is one of excellence under extraordinary pressure and perseverance in exile, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2012. We'll talk a little bit about Shelby Barnes. Shelby Pike Barnes, born in 1871, very early prodigy, one of the youngest and most naturally gifted jockeys in American history. By the time he was 17 years old, he led all jockeys in the United States with 206 wins in a single season at the age of 17, followed by 170 wins the next year when he was 18. I don't know what y'all were doing when you were 17 years old. I was not winning 200 races a year. It's extraordinarily impressive. In 1888, he won the inaugural Futurity Stakes at Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn, New York, which was the richest race in the nation at the time. Purse at the time, $40,000. In today's money, $2.5 million. Over the following years, he claimed victories in a wide variety of races. I'll go through a couple of them. Latonia Oaks, the Champagne Stakes, the Travers Stakes here at Saratoga, Belmont Stakes, and the Brooklyn Derby. A record like that placed him among the sport's all-time greats. Despite his incredible success, his career was actually incredibly short. In 1891, at just 20 years old, he voluntarily retired from the sport after only 4 years of racing. But those 4 years were some of the most extraordinary years of racing anyone had ever seen. He was the first jockey in American history to surpass 200 wins in a single year, and he was inducted into our Hall of Fame in 2011. The last gentleman we're going to talk about today is Jimmy Winkfield. Born in 1882 in Kentucky, Jimmy Winkfield began as an exercise rider at just 7 years old and went on to become one of the most accomplished jockeys in racing history. His professional breakthrough came in 1899, and within a few short years, he had achieved what few ever would, back-to-back Kentucky Derby victories in 1901 and 1902. He remains the last black jockey to win the Kentucky Derby over a century ago, in 1902. By 1904, the sport that had celebrated him began shutting out black riders, and he left the United States to continue his career in Europe. His career flourished there as well. He won championships in Russia, Poland, France, Germany, becoming an international celebrity. Now, during the Russian Revolution, in order to escape war, he led a caravan of 250 horses on an 1,100-mile trek on foot from war-torn Russia to the safety of Poland, which is an extraordinary thing to think about. He eventually settled in France and continued training and remained a beloved figure until his death in 1974. He was inducted into our Hall of Fame in 2004. I want you to just think about Jimmy Winkfield's career for a second, because this is extraordinary. There needs to be a movie about Jimmy Winkfield's life. So he started racing in the United States, was one of the best jockeys in the United States, was forced to flee because of racism and discrimination, went to Russia. In Russia, was one of the best jockeys in Russia. Then had to flee Russia because of the Russian Revolution, eventually settling in France. Then, when World War II happened, the Nazis invaded France, and he had to flee a third time, this time from the Nazis. There's a very delightful anecdote of Jimmy Winkfield protecting his horses and hitting a Gestapo member over the head with a rake so that they wouldn't take his horses. I do not know if that anecdote is true. History is weird like that. I like to believe that it is true. And after he was long out of the sport, long retired, right? There was, American racing officials had started to realize how important a lot of these figures were, and realized that Jimmy Winkfield was still alive in the 1960s abroad. This incredible jockey who had such an extraordinary career in the United States was still alive. So racing officials in the 1960s, I believe, they had invited Jimmy, they flew him from France to the United States to have a ball in his honor to recognize his contributions to thoroughbred racing. And when Jimmy Winkfield arrived for the ball in his honor, they made him use the back entrance. He was not allowed to go in through the front door because it was whites only. an absolutely extraordinary life story, Jimmy Wingfield. And I can only give you a small chunk of it. Please read more about his life story. It's incredible. This is every black equestrian that's been inducted into our Hall of Fame. There are 8 that we have in our Hall of Fame, and all 8 of them come from the period between 1850 and 1920. A 70-year period where they basically dominated American horse racing.
Can you repeat that era, like that period?
Oh yeah, sure. So all of these jockeys had their heydays between 1850 and 1920. Between 1865 and 1905, the racetrack became a stage for one of the most remarkable and oftentimes forgotten renaissances in American sports. In the years that followed emancipation, hundreds of black trainers, grooms, exercise riders, and jockeys basically transformed our entire sport. The men that we featured in this lesson, from Ansel Williamson to Isaac Murphy to Jimmy Wingfield, represent only a fraction of the vast, interconnected black equestrian community whose labor and talent shaped the golden age of American racing. It's important to recognize that these men did not rise in isolation. Behind every champion jockey stood teams of largely black grooms, farriers, stable hands, and trainers who prepared these horses, managed their care, and passed down their knowledge from generation to generation. Stables across the country thrived because of this community. For a brief moment, the decades after emancipation opened a space where skill and merit could triumph over prejudice, where black horsemen could achieve wealth, fame, and respect that was unattainable in any other profession. By the early 1900s, that door had begun to close. And we'll talk a little bit about why that happened right now. So in this section, we're going to trace the gradual decline and impact of black equestrians in American thoroughbred racing throughout the mid to late 1900s. Largely swept out of the sport as a result of racist attitudes and aggressive legislation, black riders and trainers began to vanish from the central story of racing, but remained in a number of other roles throughout the industry. We will learn about the historical context for this decline and the key figures that helped to spur new black participation in racing beginning in the 1950s. At the dawn of the 20th century, horse racing was the quintessential American sport, and black horsemen were its soul. From the barns of Kentucky to the grandstands of New York and New Orleans, black jockeys, grooms, and trainers had built the foundation of thoroughbred racing, yet within a generation after 1900, they were basically completely gone. And this section of our presentation is going to tell you why that happened. The turn of the 20th century was supposed to be a moment of triumph. The 1890s had been an era of brilliance for black equestrians, men like Isaac Murphy, Edward Brown, Willie Sims, national celebrities across America, names printed on every racing sheet. In this era of American thoroughbred racing, black riders and trainers were household names and some of America's first sporting heroes. But beneath all of that progress, there was shifting in the political and social ground. In 1896, the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson decision ruled legalized racial segregation under the doctrine separate but equal was evidently legal and fair. What began in train cars and schools soon spread everywhere, including to the racetrack. White jockeys' guilds, now empowered by racial animosity and emboldened by Jim Crow laws, cited the Supreme Court case as justification to exclude black riders from the sport. Black riders found themselves increasingly victims of white riders and victims of violence from white riders and from white spectators. It was not unusual for crowds to pelt black riders with stones, and if you were a white jockey racing against a black jockey, it was also not unusual to take the riding crop that you had and strike your opponent with it. And if your opponent was a black rider, very rarely was any kind of judgment happened. No, there was no kind of punishment. Those rules were not enforced against black equestrians. So prominent owners soon started to think that employing white trainers and jockeys was just safer instead of continuing to employ black ones. By 1900, the same South that had once celebrated the skill of black horsemen had turned violently against them. You started to see race officials would forget to license black jockeys. In 1902, we just discussed how Jimmy Wakefield, one of the most talented riders of his entire generation, won a Kentucky Derby in 1902. By 1904, the racist violence at the racetrack was so much that he had already fled the United States. He would never again return to an American racetrack. By the 1920s, despite their utter dominance just a few decades earlier, the image of the black jockey had basically vanished from America's racetracks. Though the headlines no longer carried their names, black horsemen continued to sustain the sport from behind the scenes. They worked the barns, the breeding sheds, and the farms where champions were born. Their knowledge, refined over centuries, didn't just disappear, it moved into the shadows, relegated to various backstretch roles at racetracks across America. Black equestrians could no longer be the stars in the sport that they helped to build. And a lot of this is coming from the attitudes of the white riders and the white jockeys and the white owners of the day who could not fathom the idea that a black person could make more money than them in the sport that they were doing. So this entire racist tornado just eventually forced all of them out of the sport completely. And it became untenable for any black equestrian to continue, at least as the face of the sport. They could continue in the sport, but they could no longer be on the cover of the magazine. They could not be the heroes. So in the early decades of the 20th century, they were defined by quiet endurance. Grooms, farriers, and stablemen, many of them descendants from enslaved horsemen, passed down their expertise through word-of-mouth mentorship. The invisible city, the backstretch behind every single grandstand, became a world unto itself. Among some of these unsung heroes was Will Harbut, pictured here. Born in 1885 in Kentucky, after years of working on farms, Harbut was assigned to care for the chestnut colt that would eventually become the famous Man of War, one of the most famous racehorses in the history of our sport. Harbut tended to Man of War for decades with respect and with a little bit of showmanship and flair. He was known for leading thousands of visitors on tours of Man of War's stable, introducing them to Man of War. He had a lot of pride in his horse, would tell stories about his horse, and his presence captivated the public. In an era where black Americans were confined to service roles in the industry, he turned that confinement into a sort of power. He was always by Man of War's side and was featured in many publications and famous photographs about the famous horse. But he wasn't alone. Before him, John Buckner had been Man of War's first groom, and after Harbut, Cunningham Graves took over, preparing the horse's body for its highly publicized funeral in 1947. Together, Buckner, Harbut, and Graves carried forward a lineage of care, 3 generations of black men who held America's greatest racehorse. Across the country, black horsemen remained indispensable. Marshall Lilly, who worked under Hall of Fame trainer James Rouse Sr., exercised some of the best horses of the early 1900s, including Peter Pan and Colin. You also had Clement Brooks, a groom at Spendthrift Farm, became so famous for his partnership with the famous racehorse Nashua that tourists refer to them as Clement Nashua, famous duo. Each of these men embodied the continuing resilience of black equestrianism in the sport, despite them being taken out of the limelight. The decades after World War II saw the thoroughbred industry expand into a modern commercial empire. Racetracks became centers of glamour, attracting Hollywood stars and wealthy owners. Yet the workers who made the spectacle possible, those who fed, walked, and trained the horses, remained largely invisible, their contributions unacknowledged. Still, on the backstretch, a distinct black culture began to thrive. Horse care was passed from father to son and sometimes mother to daughter. In 1954, Sylvia Bishop, who's pictured here, began as a hot walker at the age of 14, and she became the first black woman to hold a trainer's license in the United States. This achievement was unthinkable in the male-dominated and still segregated racetrack culture of the 1940s. You also had people like Eugene Carter, who had shadowed Will Harbert as a boy. He became an exercise rider and horse breaker, later working at Saxony Farms for more than 25 years. Despite being denied a jockey's license and unable to ride, Carter still built a long and respected career, proof that skill and persistence could still endure even in a segregated industry. Even as black horsemen kept the industry running, very few were permitted to hold official licenses. Those who did often had to work double hard for half of the recognition. Oscar Dishman Jr. became one of the few black trainers to achieve national success as the leading trainer at Cincinnati's River Downs in the 1960s. By the 1970s, Dishman was training 40 thoroughbreds at a time. Elsewhere, black horsemen like Walter Edwards Jr., John Joe Hughes Jr., and Marshall Lilly continued to define excellence behind the scenes. Their work stretched across decades, feeding, training, exercise riding, and hauling horses in every corner of the world. They worked in a segregated world where they could touch the sport's greatest animals, but rarely share its stage. During these years, racing's leadership began to reckon, however slowly, with its forgotten history. The graves of its early black champions were rediscovered. In 1967, the remains of Isaac Murphy were reinterred beside Man of War at Kentucky Horse Park, symbolically reuniting two of the sport's greatest figures. Later in 1995, the Isaac Murphy Award was established to honor the jockey with the highest winning percentage each year. During the 1996 Derby Week, Churchill Downs erected a headstone for Oliver Lewis, the black rider who was the first jockey to win the Kentucky Derby over 100 years earlier. Notable riders and trainers were, admittedly slowly over the years, recognized by the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame. We talked about Isaac Murphy being inducted in 1955. Many of his contemporaries are also members of our Hall of Fame, like Willie Sims, James Wingfield, Shelby Barnes. The Civil Rights Movement changed America, and eventually it changed racing as well. By the 1970s, a new generation of black equestrians began to reappear in the public eye. Cheryl White, pictured here on the cover of Jet magazine, the daughter of a trainer from Ohio, became the first black female jockey in 1971 at the age of 17. She earned her first win on the racehorse Genellara at Waterford Park in West Virginia 3 months later. Her photo here that year announced to the nation that old barriers could be broken. Over her career, White amassed more than 200 wins and later became a race steward. In 2000, Marlon St. Julian rode Q Rule in the Kentucky Derby, becoming the first black jockey to compete in the Derby in 79 years. His presence there at that Derby in 2000 symbolized the burgeoning resurgence of black equestrianism in America's oldest sport. Following in his wake came riders like Deshaun Parker, one of only a handful of jockeys in history to exceed 6,000 wins, and Kendrick Carmouche, a third-generation jockey with over 4,000 wins and $170 million in lifetime career earnings. Carmouche's success echoed the extraordinary success of his predecessors, not just in the saddle, but as an ambassador for representation in horse racing. He races across the street at Saratoga every summer. So you go over to Saratoga, see if you can find Kendrick. He is also the nicest guy I've ever met. He is so sweet. Say hi to him when he's going by on his horse. He will stop and talk to you. He's so cool. No story bridges the past and the present quite like the story of the Harbert family. We talked about Will Harbert, whose care for Man of War had made him a legend. But his son Tom carried on that legacy, breeding and co-owning the 1962 Derby contender Touch Bar. Yet at the 1962 Derby, he was barred from being listed in the program or sitting in the grandstand for a race that he had a horse in. 6 decades later, Tom's grandson, Greg Harbert, stood in the owner's box as his horse Necker Island who ran in the 2020 Kentucky Derby. Now that moment came in a year defined by nationwide protests over the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. Activists called on black participants to boycott the Derby that year in solidarity. Greg Harbutt chose to stay. I'm going to share a quote with him, Greg Harbutt, who said, "As an African American man involved in an industry that's not very inclusive to people who look like me, there's no way that I could sit out on one of the largest race days in the U.S. and not bring awareness to the contributions that African Americans have given to horse racing." For the Harbutts, being seen and recognized was itself kind of victory, generations in the making. Greg would go on to co-found the Ed Brown Society, named for the 19th century Hall of Famer Edward D. Brown, to create opportunities for black students entering the equine industry. And in fact, the Ed Brown Society was a consultant on the production of this seminar and this presentation. So big thanks to the Ed Brown Society and also Greg Harbutt for helping us develop this presentation for you guys tonight. In the 21st century, black equestrians continued to shape racing from every angle. Trainers like Larry Demerit, who was born in the Bahamas, carried forward the international legacy of black horsemen. He started a horse named West Virginia in the 2024 Kentucky Derby. Exercise riders, farm managers, and breeders such as Philip L. Jones, Jonathan Figgs Jr., and Charles Robinson are the lifeblood of the modern turf. And I want to talk a little bit more about Deshaun Parker. I want to spotlight his career a little bit because it's absolutely amazing. He is not only an accomplished jockey, but he's also one of the best modern jockeys to ever grace the turf. He was originally born in 1971, and he has led an astonishing career. His father, Darrell Parker, worked as a racing steward, and Deshaun loved horses very early, growing up around talented thoroughbreds. Deshaun Parker is 6 feet tall. He is taller than me, which is unusually tall for a jockey. He was told more than once that he would never make it because of his height, but he persisted. He began his career in 1988 on small tracks across the Midwest. For years, he rode wherever he could find bounce, building his reputation the hard way through persistence, consistency, patience, and a lot of falling off of racehorses. Then, quietly, he began to rewrite the history books. In 2010, he led all jockeys in the nation by total wins. He was the first black rider to hold that distinction since 1895. The last one was James Perkins, 1895. Deshaun Parker repeated that feat the very next year in 2011. In 2022, he joined an elite group of just 21 jockeys in American history to surpass 6,000 career victories. In fact, his 6,000 career victories makes Parker the winningest black jockey in American racing history. A legacy built on the foundation of excellence first established by Hall of Famers like Isaac Murphy and Willie Sims a century earlier. In 2021, Parker won the George Wolfe Memorial Jockey Award, given to riders with exceptional careers and characters that helped to advance the sport. And though challenges remain, a cultural shift is underway. We are starting to see new exhibits, new programs, exhibitions like the Black Heritage in Racing at the Kentucky Derby Museum, history projects like the Chronicle of African Americans in the Horse Industry, and, most recently, Keeneland Library's Heart of the Turf, Racing's Black Pioneers, whose research was instrumental in the development of this presentation. From the enslaved horsemen of the 17th century to the modern professionals of the 21st, black equestrians have shaped every stride of American racing. Their legacy stretches from colonial plantations to Churchill Downs, from the invisible stables of the past to the televised triumphs of today. They were the trainers, riders, caretakers who made this sport possible. Even when it refused to see them, their story is not just one of exclusion, but of endurance and resurgence. Here's a couple of books you might want to look into if you want to read more about this legacy and about this history. This presentation that I gave to you today was only an hour, but there's only one thing. If you take away anything from tonight, there is always more to learn. This story is centuries old, and I encourage you to continue reading, continue doing your research. In particular, I am very fond of Lexington by Kim Wickens. It is not only one of my favorite equine books, but it's one of my favorite books, period. I think that book is the go-to tome for horse racing before, during, and after the Civil War. If you check out any of them, Lexington is great, but all the books that you see up there are fantastic, including the Hall of Fame website, which is racingmuseum.org, where you can find biographies of all of the Hall of Famers that we discussed today. And actually, while you're here, you guys are in the Hall of Fame. This is it. This is the Hall of Fame. And you can actually use these interactives behind me to find those Hall of Famers. Because all of them are right here. For example, jockey. And if I wanted to find, for example, Abe Hawkins, there he is. You can read more about our Hall of Famers in this room here. Folks, I appreciate you taking the time to come out tonight. Does anybody have any questions for me?